How did we replace huge room-sized computers that constantly broke down with technology that now underpins our entire digital world? That's what I'm exploring in today's episode about the invention of the transistor. Hey, welcome to the Hoodie History Podcast, where I deep dive into all kinds of fascinating stories from the past from all over the world. I'm Michael, your host, and I'm connecting with you from Australia. It's great to have you here. So I love exploring the past and sharing amazing stories with you. That's what I do here at Hoodie History, and I hope you enjoy these fascinating explorations into the past with me. Here at Hoodie History, I strive to tell science-based, factually accurate stories that explore the highs and lows of human history in a way that's also respectful to cultures from around the world. I'm looking forward to exploring today's topic with you. It's a really interesting tale about an invention that we often overlook. Just quickly before I do though, I wanted to let you know that I share more history info and stories on my Hoodie History YouTube channels. I have a main one and another one that I call Hoodie History Shorts, where I publish short videos, and my Hoodie History social media accounts on TikTok and Instagram. If you want to stay connected, please do check out those other Hoodie History accounts and channels. Alright, let's get stuck into today's story. So in this episode, I'm exploring one of the most revolutionary inventions in human history, the transistor. And I know what you might be thinking, how exciting can a tiny piece of technology really be? Well, let me tell you that this little device literally transformed our entire world. What I'm focused on exploring today is how three scientists working at Bell Labs in 1947 created something that would eventually put a computer in your pocket, revolutionize communication, and pretty much create the modern world as we know it. But here's the funny thing, they had no idea what they were unleashing. They thought they were just solving a practical problem with telephone systems. Instead, they accidentally triggered the digital revolution that's still reshaping our world today. So imagine a world where the most advanced computer fills an entire room, uses as much electricity as a small town, and breaks down constantly. Then imagine three guys in a lab creating something smaller than your fingernail that would make all of that obsolete. Well, get comfy because we're about to explore how the transistor was invented and how it changed absolutely everything. Let's go back to the 1940s, to a world that would seem pretty alien to us today. This is the age of vacuum tubes, those glass bulbs that glowed orange and got incredibly hot, kind of like old-fashioned light bulbs but much more complex. And these vacuum tubes were everywhere in electronics. If you wanted to amplify a signal, whether it was for a radio, a telephone system, or one of those early room-sized computers, you needed vacuum tubes. They were the only game in town for controlling electrical current. But man, these things were a nightmare to work with. They were huge, some were the size of your fist. They consumed massive amounts of electricity and generated so much heat you needed cooling systems just to keep them from melting. And they burned out constantly, just like light bulbs. So if you had a computer with thousands of vacuum tubes, you'd have technicians running around replacing burnt-out tubes all day long. And let me give you some perspective on what this world looked like. ENIAC, E-N-I-A-C, one of the first electronic computers, was built in 1946, just 1 year before our story begins. This thing was massive, 30 tons, took up 18,000 square feet, that's bigger than most apartments, and used 18,000 vacuum tubes. It consumed 150 kilowatts of electricity, enough to power about 150 homes. And it broke down every couple of days because those tubes kept burning out. Telephones were a similar story. The Bell system, which pretty much had a monopoly on American telecommunications, needed enormous switching centers filled with thousands of vacuum tubes to route calls. These facilities were like industrial plants, with massive cooling systems and teams of maintenance workers. Making a long-distance call was expensive and technically challenging because all the equipment was so unreliable. Radio was probably the most successful vacuum tube technology of the era, but even household radios were big, heavy pieces of furniture that took several minutes to warm up when you turned them on. Portable radios existed, but they were the size of suitcases and needed heavy batteries that didn't last very long. And here's what's really wild. This was considered cutting-edge technology. People thought vacuum tubes were amazing because they could amplify signals and control electrical flow in ways that had never been possible before. The idea that you could do the same thing with something tiny, cool, and reliable was just unimaginable. The whole electronics industry was built around this assumption that if you wanted to do anything sophisticated with electricity, you needed big, hot, expensive, unreliable vacuum tubes. Companies designed products around the limitations of tube technology. Buildings were designed with special electrical and cooling systems to handle all that power consumption and heat generation. But there was a growing awareness that vacuum tubes were hitting some fundamental limits. As engineers tried to build more complex systems, better computers, more sophisticated telecommunications, miniaturized electronics, they kept running into the same problems: size, heat, power consumption, and reliability. Bell Labs, which was the research arm of the Bell telephone system, was particularly frustrated with these limitations. They were trying to build better telephone switching systems, and vacuum tubes were just too big, too hot, and too unreliable for what they wanted to accomplish. They needed something better, but nobody really knew what that might look like. So by 1947, there was this sense in the electronics industry that they were reaching a dead end. Sure, you could keep building bigger systems with more vacuum tubes, but the problems just multiplied. More tubes meant more heat, more power consumption, more failures. It was clear that something fundamentally different was needed, but nobody knew what that might be. Enter Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, and three scientists who are about to accidentally change the world: John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley. Now, Bell Labs in the 1940s was like the Google or Apple of its time. It's where the smartest scientists and engineers went to work on the most cutting-edge problems. The company had essentially unlimited resources and a mandate to invent the future of telecommunications. They'd already invented or improved everything from the transistor's predecessor technologies to early computer science concepts. The three main characters in our story couldn't have been more different. William Shockley was the team leader, brilliant, ambitious, and let's just say not the easiest guy to work with. He was a theoretical physicist who thought big and wasn't shy about taking credit. John Bardeen was a quiet, methodical physicist who would later become the only person to win the Nobel Prize in physics twice. And Walter Brattain was an experimental physicist from the Pacific Northwest who was incredibly skilled at building and testing new devices. They were working on something called the Semiconductor Research Program, trying to understand these weird materials called semiconductors that didn't quite conduct electricity like metals, but weren't insulators either. Materials like silicon and germanium had strange properties that scientists were just beginning to understand. The goal wasn't originally to replace vacuum tubes. They were trying to solve specific problems with telephone switching systems. But Shockley had this vision of creating solid-state devices, electronics with no moving parts, no glowing filaments, no vacuum chambers. It was a pretty radical idea at the time. The breakthrough moment comes in December 1947. Bardeen and Brattain are working with a piece of germanium, a silvery metalloid that they've been experimenting with for months. They're trying to understand how electrical current flows through these semiconductor materials and how they might be able to control that flow. On December 16, 1947, they're doing what seems like a routine experiment. They take a small piece of germanium and carefully place two gold contacts very close together on its surface. When they apply a small electrical signal to one contact, something amazing happens. The current flowing through the other contact gets amplified. A weak signal becomes a strong signal, just like a vacuum tube, but with a piece of germanium smaller than a fingernail. And here's the thing, they're not even sure why it works. The theory behind semiconductors is still pretty murky in 1947. They just know they've created something that can amplify electrical signals without vacuum tubes, without heating up, and without consuming massive amounts of power. Brattain later described the moment. They realized they had created an amplifier, an oscillator, and a switch. But I don't think they really understood what that meant yet. They thought they'd solved a technical problem for telephone systems. They had no idea they just invented the foundation of the digital age. The first working transistor was incredibly crude, just a piece of germanium with two gold contacts pressed against it, all mounted on a little plastic triangle. It looked like something a kid might build for a science fair, but when they tested it, it worked. It amplified signals just like a vacuum tube, but it was tiny, cool to the touch, and used almost no power. Shockley, who wasn't in the lab that day, was both thrilled and frustrated when he heard about the discovery. Thrilled because his team had achieved something revolutionary, frustrated because he hadn't been directly involved in the breakthrough moment. This tension would later cause major problems between the three scientists. Bell Labs management initially didn't know what to make of this invention. They understood it was technically impressive, but they weren't sure how commercially viable it would be. Vacuum tubes were expensive, but they were a known quantity. This new transistor, they coined the name by combining transfer and resistor, was unproven technology. They decided to announce the invention at a press conference on June 30, 1948. And here's what's wild: the press barely paid attention. The New York Times buried the story on page 46. Most people thought it was just an interesting laboratory curiosity, maybe useful for hearing aids or other specialized applications. Nobody, not even the inventors, realized they'd just set in motion the transformation of human civilization. So here's where things get really interesting and really messy. Having a working transistor in the lab is one thing, but turning it into something that can be mass-produced and commercialized is a completely different challenge. First, there's the technical problem. Those early germanium transistors were incredibly finicky. They only worked under very specific conditions, they were sensitive to temperature changes, and manufacturing them consistently was nearly impossible. Each one had to be handmade by skilled technicians, which meant they were very expensive and unreliable. And then there's the human drama. The relationship between Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley starts falling apart almost immediately. Shockley feels like he hasn't gotten enough credit for the invention, even though Bardeen and Brattain did the actual experimental work. He starts working on his own improved version of the transistor, basically cutting his colleagues out of the process. In 1948, Shockley develops what he calls the junction transistor, which is more reliable and easier to manufacture than the original point-contact transistor. But his behavior becomes so difficult that Bardeen and Brattain essentially stop working with him. Bardeen eventually leaves Bell Labs entirely to go work on superconductivity research. Meanwhile, the electronics industry is trying to figure out what to do with this new technology. The first commercial applications are pretty modest: hearing aids, portable radios, things where the small size and low power consumption of transistors give them a clear advantage over vacuum tubes. But even these early applications start showing the potential. The first transistor radio, made by Texas Instruments and Regency Electronics in 1954, is about the size of a paperback book, tiny compared to vacuum tube radios. It runs on a small battery for hours, and it works immediately when you turn it on, no warm-up time required. The military gets interested pretty quickly. They're dealing with the same problems as everyone else. Vacuum tubes are big, hot, and unreliable. But for them, these limitations can be life or death issues. A radio that fails in combat or a guidance system that overheats can get people killed. The Pentagon starts funding transistor research and pushes companies to develop military applications. But the real transformation starts in the late 1950s when scientists figure out how to make transistors out of silicon instead of germanium. Silicon transistors are much more stable, they can operate at higher temperatures, and silicon is incredibly abundant. It's basically sand. This breakthrough makes mass production feasible. And then comes the integrated circuit revolution. In 1958, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments figures out how to put multiple transistors on a single piece of silicon. Instead of wiring individual transistors together, you can etch entire circuits onto a silicon wafer. This is the birth of the microchip. But even with these advances, the transformation isn't automatic. Vacuum tube manufacturers fight back, improving their technology and cutting prices. Many engineers are skeptical of transistors. They're used to vacuum tubes, they understand how they work, and transistors seem unreliable and unpredictable. The computer industry is particularly slow to adopt transistors. IBM, the dominant computer company, has huge investments in vacuum tube technology. Their computers are reliable, their customers understand them, and switching to transistors would mean completely redesigning everything. It's like asking Ford to suddenly start making electric cars in the 1950s. But younger companies start betting big on transistors. Fairchild Semiconductor, founded by some former Shockley employees, there's that human drama again, becomes a pioneer in silicon transistor manufacturing. Intel, founded by former Fairchild employees, pushes the technology even further. The consumer electronics transformation really takes off in the 1960s. Transistor radios become incredibly popular, especially among young people who want portable music. The Sony TFM-121, introduced in 1959, fits in your shirt pocket and becomes a cultural phenomenon. Suddenly, music isn't tied to big furniture-sized radios in the living room. Television starts transitioning to transistors, which means TV sets can be smaller, more reliable, and use less electricity. Portable TVs become possible for the first time. Car radios get better and more reliable. Electronic calculators shrink from desktop-sized machines to handheld devices. But the really dramatic changes are happening behind the scenes, in industrial and military applications. Telephone switching systems become dramatically more efficient and reliable. Early computer systems become smaller and more powerful. Satellites become possible because transistors use so little power and generate so little heat. By the late 1960s, you're starting to see the emergence of what will become the personal computer industry. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation are building mini-computers that are only refrigerator-sized instead of room-sized, thanks to transistor technology. And then in 1971, Intel creates the first microprocessor, essentially a complete computer on a single chip. The 4004 processor contains 2,300 transistors, each one a descendant of that crude device that Bardeen and Brattain built in 1947. This tiny chip has more computing power than ENIAC, that room-sized computer from 1946. But even in 1971, people still don't understand what's happening. Personal computers seem like a science fiction fantasy. The idea that every household might have a computer, that people might carry computers in their pockets, that computers might be connected in a global network, all of that seems impossible. The transformation is accelerating, but it's still largely invisible to ordinary people. They can see that electronics are getting smaller and cheaper, but they can't yet see that they're living through the beginning of the digital revolution. So what does the world look like once the transistor revolution really takes hold? Well, by the 1980s and 1990s, pretty much everything has changed, though it happens so gradually that people don't always notice. First, electronics become ubiquitous and affordable. Things that were impossible or incredibly expensive in the vacuum tube era become everyday consumer products. Personal computers, which seemed like science fiction in 1970, are in millions of homes by 1990. Video games, digital watches, electronic calculators, compact disc players, all of this becomes possible because transistors make electronics small, cheap, and reliable. The workplace also gets completely transformed. Offices that once relied on typewriters, paper files, and manual calculations suddenly have computers on every desk. Banks replaced their mechanical accounting systems with electronic databases. Factories used computer-controlled machinery. Even small businesses start using electronic cash registers and computerized inventory systems. Communication changes dramatically too. The telephone system becomes completely electronic, which makes long-distance calling cheap and reliable. Mobile phones become possible, and then become small enough to actually be mobile. The internet, which starts as a military and academic network, becomes commercially viable because transistor-based computers can handle the data processing requirements. But maybe what's most dramatic is how this technology becomes invisible. In the vacuum tube era, electronics were big, obvious, and required maintenance. You knew when you were using electronic technology because it was this big piece of furniture that glowed and made noise. But transistor-based electronics just worked quietly in the background. Your car has dozens of computer systems managing everything from fuel injection to anti-lock brakes, but you don't think about them. Your microwave oven has more computing power than the room-sized computers of the 1950s, but it's just an appliance. Your digital watch contains transistors that would have been cutting-edge technology in 1960, but it's jewelry. The economic impact is staggering. The semiconductor industry, which didn't exist before 1950, becomes one of the largest and most important industries in the world. Silicon Valley, which was mostly fruit orchards in 1950, becomes the global center of technology innovation. Entire countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan build their economies around semiconductor manufacturing. And the pace of change keeps accelerating. Moore's Law, proposed by Intel co-founder Gordon Moore in 1965, observes that the number of transistors on a computer chip doubles about every 2 years. This means that computing power becomes exponentially more powerful and exponentially cheaper at the same time. For ordinary people, daily life becomes transformed in ways that would have seemed like magic in 1947. You can carry a device in your pocket that has instant access to most human knowledge. You can communicate instantly with people anywhere in the world. You can watch movies, listen to music, play games, shop, work, and socialize using devices that are smaller and more powerful than the room-sized computers of the 1940s. But there are also unexpected social and cultural changes. The democratization of information technology means that individuals and small groups can have capabilities that once required large institutions. A teenager with a laptop can create software used by millions of people. Small companies can compete with large corporations using the same digital tools. The global economy becomes increasingly interconnected because transistor-based communication technology makes it possible to coordinate complex operations across vast distances in real time. Manufacturing moves to wherever it's most efficient, supply chains become global, and economic events in one part of the world instantly affect everywhere else. So in many ways, we're still living in the world that Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley created in that Bell Labs basement in 1947. Pretty much every aspect of modern life depends on transistor technology in ways that would have been unimaginable to the inventors. Your smartphone contains about 15 billion transistors. That's more transistors than there are people on Earth, all packed into a device you carry in your pocket. Each one of those transistors is a direct descendant of that crude germanium device from 1947, but they're now so small that hundreds of them could fit on the width of a human hair. And it's not just obvious technology like computers and phones. Modern cars contain hundreds of computer systems managing everything from engine performance to safety systems. Your refrigerator probably has more computing power than the computers that sent humans to the moon. Even simple things like LED light bulbs and digital thermostats depend on transistor technology. The global economy is now essentially a digital economy. Financial markets operate using high-speed computer trading systems. Supply chains are managed by complex software. Most jobs involve using computers in some way. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us just how dependent we've become on digital technology. Suddenly everyone was working from home, going to school online, and socializing through video calls. But maybe what's most profound is how transistors have changed human knowledge and communication. The internet, which exists because transistor-based computers can process and route vast amounts of information, has created the first truly global communication system in human history. Information that once took years to spread now travels around the world in seconds. This has political and social implications that we're still figuring out. Social media, online communities, and digital activism all depend on transistor technology. Authoritarian governments struggle to control information in ways they never had to before. Democratic movements can organize and communicate using tools that didn't exist even 20 years ago. The environmental impact is huge too, both positive and negative. Transistor-based technology enables things like solar panels, electric vehicles, and smart power grids that help address climate change. But manufacturing semiconductors requires enormous amounts of energy and water, and electronic waste is becoming a major environmental problem. And we're nowhere near done with this transformation. Artificial intelligence, which is having revolutionary impacts on everything from medical diagnosis to transportation, depends entirely on transistor-based computer systems. Quantum computing, which might revolutionize computing again, still depends on conventional transistor-based systems to operate. The three scientists who invented the transistor couldn't have imagined any of this. They thought they were solving a practical problem with telephone systems. Instead, they triggered a transformation that's still reshaping human civilization 75 years later. So there you have it, how three scientists working on a practical telephone problem in 1947 accidentally invented the foundation of the digital age. It's a story about scientific curiosity, human ambition, and the unintended consequences of technological innovation. What I find fascinating about the transistor story is how it shows that revolutionary changes often come from solving mundane problems. Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley weren't trying to create smartphones or the internet. They were just trying to build better telephone switches, but their solution to that small problem ended up transforming everything. The story also shows how technological change can be both predictable and completely unpredictable at the same time. Engineers knew vacuum tubes had limitations and that something better was needed, but nobody predicted that the solution would lead to pocket computers, global communication networks, and artificial intelligence. And it's a story that's still unfolding. Every time you use a computer, check your phone, or even turn on a modern appliance, you're using technology that traces back to that December day in 1947 when two scientists in New Jersey discovered they could amplify electrical signals with a piece of germanium. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to have you join the Hoodie History community. Subscribe to the podcast, check out my YouTube channels for more explorations into history, and follow me on the socials for quick history hits. You should be able to connect on whatever platform you prefer to use. I publish news stories and videos regularly across these accounts and platforms, so stay tuned for more fascinating stories from the past. Thanks for listening to Hoodie History, and I'll catch you next time.